Real pleasure to be here. I've known Professor Zhao since 2005, and it was terrific to get her to spend a year at Maryland, but it's also such a pleasure to see through her eyes someone who truly appreciates the joys of Vermont's beautiful environment. She looks up in the morning and says, PM 2.5 must be zero here. It's so beautiful, and there's no pollution and everything. I first went to China in 1981, when the country had just opened to tourists. When I go to China with the Vermont students in a week, it will be my 31st trip to China. China was very different back in 1981. You saw people wearing drab navy and khaki Mao outfits. The only one wearing bright clothes were the little children. And the primary mode of transportation was the bicycle. Everywhere you looked, there was a sea of bicycles. And the only motor vehicles around belonged to high party officials from the Communist Party. Most Chinese, today of course, it's totally different. It's a sea of motor vehicles wherever you go, more and more vehicles on the road every day, causing serious pollution problems. Most Chinese had never seen a foreigner before in 1981. So wherever we would go, a crowd would gather around us. And I found myself always smiling and waving at crowds. I felt like I was an American political candidate. Today things are very different. We make regular tours to China. I take my Maryland students there every other spring break. And we now take the Vermont students who take the comparative US-China course to China after the work here is over. And the China environment is dramatically different than it was back then. This is a view of Shanghai in 1981. No tall skyscrapers. Looking across the Huangpu River to Pudong, Pudong was just farmers' fields. And today, it has some of the tallest buildings in the world. But this development has come with a cost of tremendous damage to the Chinese environment that's just visible wherever you go in China. So much damage that it doesn't just threaten the health of Chinese, but that of the entire planet. Now, back in the old, China has actually come a very long way from the days of Chairman Mao's war on nature, where he was encouraging people to kill birds and the like, and everyone wanted to have a little steel mill in their backyard. The National People's Congress has enacted lots of environmental legislation and regularly strengthened it over time. But China's system is highly decentralized. It's very different from the US. China's Ministry of Environmental Protection only has a few hundred employees. Our Environmental Protection Agency has 17,000 employees, and China is a country more than 3 times larger than the United States. So it's almost like the Environmental Ministry in China being like our CEQ with not a great deal of power over the locals. The real power is in the local environmental protection boards, who are subject to tremendous political pressures. And as a result, that's one reason why enforcement has been so bad. In recent years, China's experienced some shocking incidents of environmental degradation, such as when 3,000 dead pigs were floating in the Huangpu River that flows through Shanghai and is a source of drinking water. In 2006, China launched a 4-year study of soil contamination. While the study was underway, China passed its Open Information Act, pledging that, like our Freedom of Information Act, they would turn over such information. However, the study reached such shocking conclusions, it is rumored, that when it was finished in 2010, it was declared a state secret, and they'd never released the information because they were so shocked at what a large portion of Chinese soil is contaminated by heavy metals. Even in the luxury hotels in China, you cannot drink the water from the tap. They have to provide you with bottled water. It's something I always emphasize to our students when they travel to China. When they built the Olympic Village in 2008, they announced that there was going to be safe tap water for the Olympic athletes, and when I was teaching there at the time, I raised the question of, doesn't this raise kind of an environmental justice problem for the rest of us who aren't Olympic athletes? Last year, Beijing air quality got so bad that they had to come up with ways of describing extreme pollution readings because the scale only went from 0 to 500, and they had a reading as high as 755. So they came up with terms like post-apocalyptic, terrifying, beyond belief. It got so bad that, as we'll see in a moment, they had to close some of the airports because you couldn't see planes from air traffic control in Beijing. Several years ago, the World Health Organization estimated that about 700,000 Chinese were dying every year as a result of air pollution. The Chinese government was so upset it forced WHO to take that off their website. But then when last year a study came out in The Lancet that said that 1.2 million Chinese were dying of air pollution, the Chinese government admitted that it was true. And in fact, China's own Academy of Environmental Planning has concluded that pollution is costing the Chinese economy 3.5% of its GDP every year, or $230 billion. And yet the common perception at the local level is that if you do anything to improve the environment, you are hurting the economy, which is something that is a major obstacle to environmental progress in China. And in December of 2013, as I mentioned, Beijing had to close highways, shut the airport, because they had some terrifically bad pollution incidents there. Now, China is also the leading emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. The US had been the leading emitter until 2007, but look how Chinese emissions in absolute terms have soared past those of the United States. In per capita terms, the US is still much higher than China, but notice that China's per capita emissions have increased so rapidly that they're now greater than the EU and the rest of the world on average. Now in the US, when environmental conditions got so bad, the Cuyahoga River caught fire in 1969, the American public responded. We had millions of people take to the streets in our first Earth Day. And Congress responded by passing the major environmental statutes that provide the regulatory infrastructure that's in place today. China's different though. It's not a democracy. It's a one-party system. It's a communist dictatorship, even though the economy is very free and the economy is not a socialist system. An example of how different China's system is to us was when I took my students to China in 2012. Unbeknownst to me, one of the members of our group had made this banner so that when we posed for our annual photo in front of the Forbidden City in Tiananmen Square, we could thank my assistant who'd arranged all the logistics for the trip. What do you think happened when we unveiled this banner in Tiananmen Square? Our local guide started screaming, "We're all going to be arrested, we're all going to be arrested." Plainclothes police came out of the woodwork and started coming to seize the banner. Fortunately, we were able to explain to them what the banner said. They were very nice. They said, "Roll it up." They didn't even seize it, but they said, "Don't ever do that again." But it was such a great lesson for my students in the limits of free speech, that you don't have the same system that you have in the US, even though the Chinese Constitution supposedly guarantees freedom of speech. Anything that the regime thinks might be a threat to it will be not tolerated. Yet, because the central government is so concerned that pollution problems may be its undoing, they are not cracking down on environmental demonstrations. Environmental protests are happening all over China. They're growing every year, and they're a result of the public's increased dismay at pollution. However, one problem is that an awful lot of these protests are focused on not in my backyard issues. A community is told suddenly that without doing the environmental impact assessment a chemical plant's going to be placed in their backyard. So they protest. And Chinese citizens are using social media to organize protests. And as a result, these protests have often been successful in getting chemical plants to be canceled or relocated. Now, some have argued that this is not such a great thing because, as this blog post says from a Chinese citizen, everybody's all democracy, the people are standing up. PX seems to be the one thing you're allowed to protest about, and then the protest is over, and they move the plant 10 kilometers away and poison a bunch of peasants who don't have Weibo, which is like Chinese Twitter. But you know I remain optimistic. And prominent environmentalists are saying, at least, even if these are NIMBY protests, not in my backyard, at least they're a sign of a burgeoning civil society. And the US has encouraged this. When John Huntsman was ambassador to China, the US Embassy in Beijing set up its own monitor for PM 2.5 and started publishing the results real-time on Twitter. The Chinese government protested and demanded that the US shut it down. The US responded, well, you're already blocking Twitter, so the only people who can see this are not Chinese people, but Americans who have access to Twitter. Ultimately, the US didn't back down. Chinese citizens figured out how to get around the firewall, and they started realizing that the air pollution readings they were getting from their government were much lower than the real air pollution that was coming on the US feed. Largely as a result of this, I think this is really quite remarkable, the Chinese government was forced for the first time to regulate PM 2.5, the really small particulates that are the greatest threat to public health. And now you can, on your iPhone, have air quality readings daily from China. This is an old screenshot I did when the air was very unhealthy in Beijing. You can see what it's been like in the last several days there. Usually, the air only gets clean if there's been a heavy rainstorm before, although today, this is from this morning. One thing you might note, air quality is good in Beijing. That's the government's reading. That's from the US Embassy. It's still much higher. Although in Shanghai, US consulate reading is actually better than that of the Chinese government. They have PM 2.5 readings. So this is a very healthy development. In fact, Chinese have been using microblogs to try to raise money to set up more air quality monitors. So the public is becoming much more aware of what the true pollution situation is. There's long been a fair number of environmental NGOs in China. They seem to be burgeoning. One that was founded, one of the earliest that was founded in 1999 was Wang Sanfa's Center for Legal Assistance to Pollution Victims at the China University of Political Science and Law. They set up a hotline where people could call with complaints from all over China, and Professor Wang would charge into court just like environmentalists did back in the 60s in the US, even if you didn't have a lot of law behind you, to demand that pollution be stopped. As a result, he was named one of the heroes of the environment by Time magazine. The BBC did this documentary that followed him to a village where the water had been polluted by a tannery as he was trying to gather evidence for the case. And he's a very strategic thinker. Every October, he holds a training session in environmental law, free for anyone who's willing to agree to do pro bono cases for him in the future. So he now has a network of environmental lawyers all over China. One of the officially endorsed NGOs there, it's very hard to register as an NGO in China, although they've gradually been relaxing some of the regulations, is the All China Environment Federation. When we met with them last summer, they were very embarrassed at the time because the latest draft of reforms in the Chinese environmental law were going to say that they were the only public interest group that could bring environmental public interest litigation. Yet even this government-endorsed NGO, whose main leader is a retired Chinese Air Force general who's decided to devote his retirement to protecting the environment, has a hard time getting courts to accept their cases. They represented the fishermen who had lost their livelihood when ConocoPhillips, a foreign oil company based in the US, had a small oil spill in Bohai Bay. Yet when they tried to file their case in court, the court wouldn't accept the lawsuit. I did a workshop for them in March of 2012 when my Maryland students were there with me, and their eyes bugged out when I told them about the multi-billion-dollar settlement that BP had reached for the oil spill in the US. Many of these Chinese NGOs have decided the best strategy is not so much litigation, but transparency initiatives. Ma Jun's Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs, inspired by the US Toxics Release Inventory, has published a website with information about who's doing what pollution over China. One of his most brilliant recent projects was he organized 23 Chinese NGOs to do a systematic audit of the supply chain of major multinational electronics companies. And he found that many of their suppliers were violating Chinese environmental and labor laws. They publicized it. One of the worst was Apple computer suppliers. Apple initially tried to ignore them, but ultimately, when a second report by Ma Jun's group came out, they agreed to independent annual audits of their Chinese supplier, and now, each year in their supplier responsibility report, they report on how many audits they did, how many firms were violating the laws, and how they corrected these violations. They even praised Ma Jun and NRDC's Linda Greer, one of my former EDF colleagues, in their annual report. And as a result, Ma Jun has won the Goldman Environmental Prize. NRDC, using China's open information law, has been encouraging local governments to comply with information requests by doing a kind of annual US news rating of how well different cities are doing in providing pollution information. And as a result, beginning this January, China has now mandated something somewhat similar to our toxics release inventory, that major companies have to report data. Greenpeace, when it first came to China, did a protest in Tiananmen Square and everyone got arrested. They now realize there are limits to what you can do, but what they're focusing on primarily is influencing Chinese social media. They have 17 employees in Beijing who monitor what people are saying about the environment, and that's where they're putting a lot of efforts. Now, finally, with respect to greenhouse gas emissions, you can see China's now the largest emitter in the world. But it's still, on a historical basis, its emissions are still much lower than those of the United States. On a per capita basis now, it's actually even with or past the EU, but China was resisting doing anything about capping greenhouse gas emissions. The day after the Obama administration took office, the State Department asked me to go on a lecture tour of China to talk up the notion that China should commit to limit its greenhouse gas emissions. I got nothing but pushback everywhere I went. At the Dalian Academy of Sciences, prominent professors said, the global warming isn't real. If it's real, it's not caused by humans. If it's real and it's caused by humans, China still shouldn't do anything. But a year later, everything had changed with respect to the Chinese attitude towards climate change problem. And I think two of the reasons for that was, first, they got so much criticism at Copenhagen in 2009 for not agreeing to limit their emissions. And secondly, they discovered that they have a real green technology as an economic opportunity. They have advanced technology in wind energy, in solar energy, and in electric cars. Although I don't think their electric car technology is quite as good as the US Tesla Motors. Tesla now has, this is the Tesla dealership that just opened in Beijing. It's flooded with rich Chinese wanting to buy electric cars. As a result, China in March 2011, in their 12th five-year plan, prominently featured the importance of responding to climate change. And when President Obama had his first summit with President Xi Jinping, they agreed to use the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer to phase out production of hydrofluorocarbons because they're a potent greenhouse gas. Now, as Professor Zhao is going to mention, there have been some recent moves to toughen Chinese environmental law and regulations. Last fall, the state council approved tough air quality emissions plans ordering major metropolitan areas to slash levels of PM 2.5. Still, by 2017, the permissible levels are going to be several times greater than in the United States. Just this spring, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang declared war on pollution, and the National People's Congress made basic changes for the first time since 1989 in its basic environmental law. What was unusual about this was it was a law that took 4 different readings. And in March, we played a small role in resolving a controversy. There was a dispute between the National People's Congress Standing Committee on the Environment and the Ministry of Environmental Protection. Ministry of Environmental Protection said, you've declared war on pollution, we have to make our laws more enforceable. And one of the things they proposed was to calculate penalties based upon the days of violation. Ministry of Environmental Protection said that's what the US does. Standing Committee said, we don't believe you, we think that's too harsh. So MEP said, what if we brought a team of American experts to testify before you to explain how US law is enforced? So we quickly assembled a group that included me, an academic, an NRDC public interest environmental lawyer, and a industry lawyer, and we spent an entire day. They called it the Green Dialogue. They had a list of questions they asked us, with the first one being, are you really serious about daily violations? And James Holmkamp, who represents the mining industry, works at Holland and Hart. After I said it was a fundamental principle of US environmental law to calculate fines based on days of violation, he said, the mining industry clients all know that, and we agree, it's accepted in the US. And the environmentalists were thrilled when the Standing Committee relented and China amended its environmental protection law in those ways. So now I'm going to turn it over to Professor Zhao, who's going to talk about some of those changes and whether or not that's really going to be enough to make great progress in protecting the environment in China.
Good afternoon. So I just want to briefly introduce 3 things about China's new basic environmental protection law, because this law just passed in April of this year. So after 25 years, this basic environmental protection law in China, it's the most important law in China's environmental protection. Has passed. So many background stories about that. And at the same time, I want to introduce the main contents and innovation about this, what we call the most stringent environmental law in China's history. The third part, I want to anticipate the future about this law, maybe including about the environmental situation in China. So, because it's a basic environmental protection law, is so important, but did not revised for more than 20 years. So the Congress and the scholars and the ordinary people, they just have our plan, or they just have some arguments about that. Do we really, it's about 5 years ago, do we really need to revise this basic environmental protection law in China? At the beginning, a lot of different arguments about that. Some people said maybe we don't need to revise this law because in China we have many departmental environmental protection laws, such as air pollution control law, water pollution control law, noisy pollution control law, and solid waste. Just as your framework, we have so many this kind of environmental control law. But at the same time, still some people argue that because that's a basic, and we are a statute law system, a civil law system, we do not have the case law system. So we must have a very important general idea, environmental law to fix the principles and the mean systems. Maybe it's general, maybe it's abstract, but we must have this kind of new revision of the law. So gradually, we get the consensus that we must revise that law from 1989. Many years changed the whole situation about China's ecology and economic and about China's environmental situation. But about 2 or 3 years, another argument or debate happened again, and they just wondered if we really need to change this basic law greatly. That were funny that our Congress have a very specific standing committee of environmental legislation, and they just discussed with our MEP, Ministry of Environmental Protection, and just discuss or negotiate with them, because our MEP just in charge of the drafts and the main idea or suggestion about this new revision of this legislation. And our Congress just told them, I think this law cannot be changed greatly because some other central departments, the agencies, especially some economic departments, they would not like you change a lot about this basic environmental protection law. And our MEP are really confused about that, but our MEP is pretty weak compared to your EPA in the US. And many very strong central economic departments, agencies, they just upset about the very big change about it. So our Congress is so-called rubber stamp committee, and they do not want to enter the other strong agencies. So they just talk to the MEP at that. So that's the story. So, but soon the things changed, like Professor Percival just introduced. One thing is, it's really worse and worse about China's air quality, especially in Beijing. And at the beginning of the 2013, at the beginning of that, there's a lot of international media report that China, especially Beijing, just have so serious hazard and haze and this kind of bad environmental situation. At the same time, from 2007 until now, from here to there, many local environmental protests happened again and again. The local government, at first, they didn't take care about these kind of protests, but because they want to develop more important big projects. But soon they found that the situation is seems out of control, and they must think more about the common people's ideas about the environmental awareness. So at the same time, I just want to mention not only the social society, the bottom people, they have so angry about the China's environmental situation. It what we so-called the rich club, which I mean our national People's Congress, they have a lot of representatives, which they will have a very big meeting at the beginning of every year to discuss some very important issues in China. And in that meeting in 2013, and they just gave many veto of non-confidence to our MEP. That means our MEP, first time criticized by the rich club deeply, greatly. As the same situation happened in our Congress that environmental committee, they got a very high veto about what we call the veto about of the non-confidence at the same time. So our administrative agency about environment and our legislative agency about environment both got a very big criticized from the rich club. So that means from the bottom to the up, all the people really unsatisfied with China's environmental situation. So the Congress attitude changed a lot. From the beginning, they even hesitated about, do we really need to revise the law? So now, why this, what we call the most strict environmental law in China's history just came into being, because they faced a lot of pressure from China's all different levels. So here I just want to introduce briefly about why we call it is the most strict environmental law in China's history. Just to give you some examples, they just emphasize two aspects. One is administrative punishment enforced a lot. Two is the judicial channels maybe enforced a lot. So, for example, this is the responsible peoples who would face up to 15 days detention if their enterprises a lot of situations, at least 8 situations, that maybe your own freedom will be limited by the polluter's action or relative actions. So the second, like the daily-based fine system. At the beginning, originally we do not have this. Maybe you polluted several days, many days, you just can get one-time fine. So this time, you pollute one day, you will get the fine for one day. So, and another one like the EIA system, environmental impact assessment system. Maybe the companies and the consultant organization who made the EIA report, they will buy the joint liability if they did some wrong thing. And the local officials still be limited a lot if they do the things like have the information or did not do the proper supervision action, etc. So for that, many administrative measures strengthened by China's this new law. At the same time, we just established the what we call public interest litigation system in this new law. It's similar as your citizen suits, but in China we just established that in this law because the specific detail is who can sue and have the right or power to raise the public interest litigation. Because environmental torts cases are really complicated and need a lot of money, a lot of time. So the public interest litigation, at first in this kind of articles, they just at the beginning, the first revision, draft revision, they just regulate one NGO in China with a very strong governmental background can have this kind of power. So the big debate caused by the ordinary people and all over China. So second revision, they expanded that to almost 10 NGOs. The third time, they revised it to about the final revision is about 300 NGOs can have this kind of rights. But it's a pity that the individuals excluded from this power or this right to raise the public interest in litigation. So a lot of people, they are so, including some American scholars or Chinese scholars and many people, they're just excited about this new law because it shows Chinese government or litigation legislation, their strong mind to change the things. So I just want to anticipate the future about this law. First thing, I don't think it's so optimistic about these laws, although it shows a strong mind, because it's only 70 articles and very simple 70 articles. The 70 articles mostly including some very abstract systems, such as we have an ecological red line system. This one is really incomplete in our country's practice. And we still have our system named economic compensation. So all these abstract systems maybe cannot solve the problem, but that's just regulated in the law. So it's still too general, too simple. The second part I just want to say, in China, the environmental challenges came from the regional protectionism. That means the local government have the so strong mind want to develop the economy and can be promoted by this kind of incentives instead of protect the environment, because the environmental protection is a so long-term action and cannot see the instinct effects quickly. So the basic structure about that cannot be changed by this only one basic law. So I don't think it's very optimistic just to rely on this law to change the whole situation about the regional protectionism. The third thing is China's administrative enforcement problem and China's judicial system independence or not independence problem are all the same as before. So we need a lot of supporting things to, or regulations or measures to implement this basic law. So maybe that can make some change. Instead of that, I think even our Supreme Court just want to establish the environmental court in the highest level of China's judicial court, but I still think the main point is they maybe do not have enough cases because the plaintiffs are so rare and the environmental cases are so difficult. So it depends. I think in the future, we must say what specifically things happen for that. Otherwise, just this simple law cannot play a very important role. That's just my own perspective. Thank you very much.
有问题吗？ Any questions?
Thank you. That was really, really good presentation. I really enjoyed it. I work on the China program, and we have an associate director who's now on the ground in mainland. She's now in China, and she actually said very similarly, there's a lot of great things that's happening on paper in China, but she is still a little bit discouraged when in practice it's not really working. So I really think that you summarized this really well, this slide, in terms of what's going on with the new law. What else do you think could help in actually getting this new law implemented in such a way that people can really make use of it? One of the things that I heard that the Supreme People's Court is thinking of establishing regional environmental courts. Do you think that's one of the mechanisms that could help in promoting this?
Many of the provinces have environmental courts, and one problem's been they haven't had a whole lot of cases because the cases that are brought are like common law cases, and it's so difficult to prove individual causal injury, although China does have a burden of proof shifting element in the law that's possible to invoke in some cases. So I think a lot of environmentalists are skeptical, why is the Supreme Court creating a green tribunal when there are not even enough cases at the local levels? I mean, the fundamental change has to come from reducing coal use, which has contributed to so much of the environmental problems, so much of the greenhouse gas emissions, and there have been orders from the central government to some provinces to limit how much coal they use. Just the other day, they started cracking down on provinces that were importing coal for coal to gas projects and without any awareness of the environmental consequences of the water use and emissions that would produce. They've certainly got to do more, I think, to centralize the system if the central government's really going to have more of an impact. But when you don't have a long tradition of respect for the rule of law or an independent judiciary, it's very difficult by just tinkering with the basic environmental law to expect that there'll be fundamental changes. What's your perspective?
In China, we have the special environmental courts for more than 130. So they developed quickly in recent 5 years. But as Professor Percival said, the main problem, they even do not have case about environmental torts. Because for the individuals, they're difficult to read this kind of, the individual victims, they're difficult to read this kind of environmental cases. And for NGOs, maybe they still have some problem about their capacity. And when I was in Percival, I worked there, I just tried to push our prosecutors can sue this kind of stand by the ordinary people to sue, but our prosecutor system really don't want this kind of rights. So it's a diploma that no people even want to read this kind of cases. So I don't know. Maybe in the future, if we have more regulations, can facilitate them to sue about the public interest litigation or the ordinary environmental torts cases. Maybe the things will change a little bit.
This question is specifically about greenhouse gases, and it fits exactly into the model you talked about past and present. About 2 years ago, when I talked seriously with senior folks at the Ministry of Environmental Protection about greenhouse gases, I got a two-part response. The first part was, this is the first generation in millennia that has not had a famine, and that depends upon understanding the weather, and climate change would be terribly destructive for China. But the second part was, even so, even more important is we will never again have unequal treaties, which is a phrase which goes back to the 1830s to 1880s when the treaties were imposed. And I would talk to someone like Jiaotong, and he would say, yes, we have to deal with climate, but unless the rest of the world acts on it, we won't. And then it turned out that the definition of unequal or equal treaties didn't just mean future emissions. It meant compensation for past emissions, which last for up to a century. And the set of criteria for an equal treaty were morally justifiable, but pragmatically impossible to achieve. And I came away from those conversations very depressed at the prospects of actually seeing climate issues dealt with in China if the context was always that first one had to bring the Western powers to heel, if that may be the right phrase. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, for a long time, the line was, we're still a developing country. You know, if you go to Beijing or Shanghai, they don't look like a developing country, but they have hundreds of millions.
But there's 700 million people being moved out of the land.
Areas. So they would rely on the clause in the Framework Convention on Climate Change that said common but differentiated responsibilities. I mean, the whole initial bargain at Kyoto was developed countries would control their emissions first to show they were serious, then the developing world's big developers like India and China would follow. But unfortunately, Bush pulled us out of that, and the US didn't do that. Now, I think what's happening is they've still refused to agree to an international treaty that will actually cap their emissions because they're afraid that that might limit their economic growth. But they have agreed, as part of the Copenhagen Accord, to improve the energy efficiency of their economy by 40% by 2020. And what they're actually doing now is they have these 7 pilot programs in major cities for cap and trade of carbon emissions. And they argue that by 2015, 2016, they'll expand that nationwide. The people I've talked to that actually have worked with some of those programs say it's less cap and more trade. And there haven't been all those many trades, so it hasn't been anything that can really inspire confidence that it's truly going to be a nationwide cap and trade program. Of course, that's more advanced than anywhere in the US except for California and the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative here in the Northeast to at least be trying those programs. So they're certainly moving in the right direction on climate change. But I think what was so significant about Xi Jinping's agreement with President Obama on hydrofluorocarbons is it's kind of a new model. The new model is we don't need a global agreement that has every little country agreeing to the same thing. The two of us, as the two largest greenhouse gas emitters in the world, are the only two countries that can really have a major say in our own destiny with respect to climate change. So if we work bilaterally together, develop initiatives like that, and in good faith control our emissions, the rest of the world will have to follow. I think that's sort of the path that they're pursuing now. Now, in Paris in 2015, they're supposed to agree on a new successor to the Kyoto Protocol. Right now, I don't know what the Chinese position is going to be on that. But at least the US has done a lot with its own existing Clean Air Act to show that it's serious about controlling greenhouse gas emissions.
I mostly agree with your ideas, and I think that our trail cap and retreat is not so. I think it's not so easy because we tried for almost 30 years already. This time is just a new term, but still I think it's not so easy because it's market-based methods. In China, it's, even in US or European countries, it's not so so easy sometimes. But for China, I think we mostly should depend on the command and control method instead of the market-based method about the emission, carbon emission. But in China, we regulate from the 11 5-year plan to 12 5-year plan about the carbon emission intensity thing. So I think that's really workable. But China need to, I think China need to, government need to make more strict standard or this kind of line to do the emission thing. Otherwise, it's really increased so fast. I mean, the carbon emission.
Would you mind if I ask a follow-up question? As I remember the 11th 12-year plan and the 11th 5-year plan, it spoke about a quadrupling of the economy with only a doubling of energy, which of course means twice as much efficiency, and that sounds great, except that a doubling of energy on a planet that needs an 80% reduction doesn't sound great. The 12th 5-year plan is, I found it hard to understand what it meant when I tried to look at it in terms of expected emissions. It clearly talked about greater efficiency and greater intensity of output per unit of resources, but it didn't seem to really talk about shooting for a cap or a restraint on emissions. Is that a fair reading?
Yeah, they have not agreed to any cap at all.
Or even as a goal, I mean.
Right. But in theory, they will tell you behind closed doors that they realize that there has to be some cap if we're going to solve the problem worldwide.
A simpler version of that question. Do you feel there's much possibility of China replacing coal in the electricity sector in the next 20 or 30 years with either renewables, hydro, whatever, carbon capture? I mean, is there much technical discussion about, just look at coal, forget everything else, how much coal use could be reduced over the next two decades?
Well, their renewable energy law.
Can you repeat the question, please? Can you repeat the question, please? Thank you.
The question was how much of China's coal use in the electricity sector could be reduced in the next 20 or 30 years?
They have, in their renewable energy law, mandated that there be a huge increase in renewable energy so that by 2020 it's at least 15% of their electric generation. What they're kind of hoping to do, I think, is to emulate the US through hydraulic fracturing to increase the availability of natural gas, to use that in electric generation as well. That hasn't really happened yet, but I think that's what their hope is ultimately.
Yes, I think the core of using will decrease in China greatly because the air quality, maybe not carbon emission thing, but because the serious so dirty air quality, so they must from now on the natural gases we purchase from all over the world just want to make sure the air quality will improve a little bit. So I think the course using will really come down.
Thank you. That's about it for time. Thanks for being here.